Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for the Holocaust Center for Humanities Lunch and Learn program today with Gerda Haas. My name is Julia Thompson, and I am the Education Program Manager at the Holocaust Center. Our community partner for this Lunch and Learn is Temple Beth El. Thank you also to the Tacoma Jewish Community Fund for sponsoring the 2021 Lunch and Learn series. I will take a moment to acknowledge that the Holocaust Center for Humanity here in downtown Seattle sits on the ancestral lands of the Duwamish people, the first people of Seattle. The Duwamish continue to honor, practice, and share their heritage and culture, and we humbly strive to join them in this endeavor. Yesterday marked the beginning of Women's History Month, and at the Holocaust Center, we know that women's Holocaust experiences are important to bring to light any month of the year. So many of the stories in our Survivor Encyclopedia on our website remember and honor the women who survived the Holocaust and then shared their stories so that we can learn from their experiences. We're so grateful to the survivors and their families who have entrusted these precious stories into our care. You can check out the Holocaust Center's social media platforms, website, and newsletter this March to learn more local stories about women during the Holocaust. One of these innumerable strong women, Holocaust survivor Gerda Haas, spoke on her experience and gave testimony for decades in the Seattle-Tacoma area before she passed away. Her son, Henry, and daughter-in-law, Kate, are today's presenters. Henry and Kate joined the Center's Speakers Bureau several years ago to carry on Gerda and the whole family's legacy. Henry himself was born in Berlin, Germany in 1938. Not a safe place nor safe time to be born Jewish. In short order, his family had to make a decision about whether to leave their home country for some place of relative safety. The ensuing attempts and journey eventually brought the Haases to Shanghai, China, an unlikely harbor of refuge for nearly 20,000 European Jews. Henry's wonderful wife, Kate, is his co-presenter. The two of them will take you through this global journey in a tumultuous time in history that ended in our own corner of the world. We will have time toward the end of the hour to take your questions, so please add yours to the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Henry and Kate, thank you so much for being here to present your story. I will hand it over to you to begin.
Good. You're on, Henry.
Oh, yes, I'm sorry. Thank you. We're so pleased to be able to share this story with you today. My parents, Ivan Hans Haas, later known as John, and my mother, Gerda Buchheim, were both born in Berlin, Germany in 1911 to 1914, respectively. Both of their families had a long history in Germany going back hundreds of years. Both families also happened to live in the same apartment house in the center of Berlin, and both families practiced Orthodox Judaism. Now, I'd like to share with you some photos of my family. All right, these photos are of my father's family, and the photo in the upper left-hand corner in the center of it are his parents, my grandparents, who eventually also ended up in Shanghai. Of this family gathering, 9 out of these 20 people in that picture eventually, unfortunately, ended up being murdered in the Holocaust. The bottom left-hand picture is my father and his 2 sisters and his brother at the front of the picture. My father's 2 sisters, one of them also ended up with us in Shanghai. The other sister actually ended up in Calcutta, India. His younger brother, who is pictured in the center picture, Herbert, he and his wife, and they were 23 and 21 years of age, were picked up by the Nazis in Holland when they were attempting to escape and go to Palestine. And unfortunately, they also then ended up, both of them, in Auschwitz and were murdered there. And the picture on the right is a wedding celebration that just sort of illustrates the sort of rich family life that that my father had in his youth. The next slide is, no, the next slide is that of my mother's family. I'm sorry, we need to go back a slide. All right. This one is my mother's family. The upper left-hand corner again is my mother, her parents, her sister. The lower left-hand picture is a Buchheim family. Again, 6 out of 13 of those folks ended up being murdered. And the center picture are my mother's parents, my grandparents. These are the grandparents that I never knew, because they would not leave and they would not go to Shanghai. This picture is my grandfather in his World War I German Army uniform, and he felt that he was protected. These grandparents were among the last Jews surviving in Berlin, and they were picked up and deported to Auschwitz in March of 1943. The picture on the right is my mother, her sister, and her mom. Now, my mother, during her lifetime, made an oral history, which was filmed, and in the next slide, she is going to introduce herself now.
My name is Gerda Haas. I was born in Berlin on April 11th, 1914.
Now, these photos are of my mother enjoying her life in Germany as a young woman. Pictured on the left, my mother and her sister. Her sister also ended up in Shanghai with us. My mother decked out in the center picture. Upper right, my mother in school. On the far right, her ambition was to become a teacher. And because of the Nazi laws and the prohibition against Jews continuing education in 1935, she was no longer permitted to continue her education. The lower right hand is my mother's driver's license in Germany when she was 18 years old, and you'll see the Nazi insignia on that document.
So after World War I, Germany found itself facing some extremely angry enemies, and they all sat down with Germany in Paris at Versailles to sign the Treaty of Versailles, which meant that Germany had to pay major reparations to various countries. Just about at the same time, the globe was going into an economic depression and money became worthless. And many people started to look for scapegoats, and they blamed the socialists, the communists, and the Jews. And anti-Semitism began to increase. And in the picture on the right, there's an unemployment line in Hamburg, and on the wall, there's a sign which is hard to read, but it says, "Vote Hitler." In 1933, there was an election and the Nazi Party came to power. Now, Hitler was not elected, actually. Hitler, who was part of the Nazi Party, was appointed by the Kaiser as the Chancellor on January 30th, 1933. And once he was in power, he enabled various fascist things to laws to take place. And he managed to get himself, because he had a majority in the party, an emergency powers called the Enabling Act, which was passed in March of 1933.
So this document is a national. My father in 1933, and he at that time he was only 22 years old, and obviously because of the things that were happening, he applied for and obtained dual citizenship because his father had originally come to Germany from Czechoslovakia. So this is a document that says that he has Czechoslovakian citizenship for a period of 10 years. This will come in of some use subsequently in this story. Now, notwithstanding the conditions that were going on and the rise of Hitler and the Nazi Party and the Enabling Act and the laws that were going on, my parents as young people continued to live their life in Germany. My father actually had gone into the fur business, and so in 1935 they were married, and then they continued to stay there despite the fact that there were many people that were leaving and that were immigrating to other countries at that time through a normal immigration process, but they were still there. And in fact, they even attended the Olympic Games of 1936 in Berlin. They were present at the stadium when that famous encounter occurred where Hitler would not acknowledge the black US sprinter, Jesse Owens, and so forth. So they continue on, and then I am born in Berlin on April 8, 1938. The document on the screen is my birth certificate, and again, you can see the Nazi insignia on it. And my actual given name, as appears on that document, is Henry, which was obviously not a German name. The German version would have been Heinrich. And because of that Czechoslovakian citizenship, my parents were able to choose whatever name they wanted, as opposed to a prescribed list that Jewish parents had to use at that time to choose to name their children.
So what happened was that Gerda had agreed, since she was having a child, that they probably should be leaving and getting out. And they, in July, 3 months after Henry was born, they left Berlin and made the trip to Nitra in Slovakia, which is where Samuel Haas, Grandpa Haas, had been sent because he was from Slovakia and Hitler had thrown out all the people who were foreigners. And so they made it to Prague, made it to Nitra. And they were there about 3 weeks, and suddenly there was a Nazi presence and they decided they better leave, and they made their way to Prague in later that year. And they stayed in Prague for an extended period of time. Okay. So what happened also in 1938 is that November, we had Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, and it was a nationwide organized pogrom, burning hundreds of synagogues, looting and destroying many Jewish homes, schools, and community offices. 7,500 Jewish business were vandalized, and Jews were beaten, and more than 90 people were killed. And you see the pictures of burning synagogues and shattered storefronts. Anti-Semitism was on the rise, and Hitler really used that to his advantage. He said that the Germans themselves, the Nazis themselves, considered themselves Aryans, a distinct European race. He didn't consider the Jews to be Aryans. He wanted racial purity. And so he began to build his whole attack on the Jewish people. And you will see on the right a picture of a dog sitting on a bench, and behind that dog it says "Nur für Arier," which means only for Aryans. But the dog could sit on the bench, but Jews couldn't.
So these are a couple of pictures in Prague, as Kate indicated. We actually ended up being in Prague over a period of several months. On the left, I'm in a baby carriage with my parents. The other pictures will show you the German presence in Prague. And so eventually we had to leave. Again, now bearing in mind that during this period, my parents had no destination in particular. They had no legal papers. They just had to keep on the run and figure out how they were going to get out.
So consequently, a plan had to be made, and Henry's Haas grandma, who had remained behind in Berlin, had determined through a variety of sources that it might be possible to make your way to Shanghai, China. And they phoned back and forth, and the decision was made in their plan that Gerda and Henry and the grandpa Haas, Samuel Haas, would return to Berlin, where the grandpa could receive a ticket for the ship, and Gerda could see her parents again. In the meantime, John did not return to Berlin. Hans, John, that's what we call him. He, as Henry mentioned, he was in the fur business, and he had furs, and he decided he needed to try and sell them to get money. So he put them on a train to Amsterdam, and he did not get on that train because he didn't want to be associated with the suitcases in case the Gestapo was on the train, and he boarded a different train to Amsterdam. He made his way to Aachen, which is on the border of Germany and Holland, and then from there he made his way to Amsterdam, where he met his friends and was able to receive the money that they had managed to get from selling the furs. Then with his money in hand, he was making his way to Paris, where his mother's brother, Richard Zienerzoon, had fled in 1934. And he and his wife were taking refuge in Paris. And John made his way across Belgium and northern France, walking, taking cars, buses, got arrested at one point, but somebody took pity on him and let him out. And he made his way to Paris. In the meantime, when that was finished, Gerda and the grandpa left Berlin with Henry and took a train to Salzburg. And Gerda's mother went with her to Salzburg, where she had said, I don't like you traveling with this baby. You should leave him with me. And Gerda said, nope, where I go, he goes. And so then from Salzburg, Gerda and the grandpa and Henry went to a little Italian village on the Italian Riviera. There's just a little village, we've been there, called Alassio. Why Alassio, Gerda never knew, but the grandpa seemed to have a sense that that's where they needed to be. And from Alassio, the grandpa was able to take his ticket and cross the border legally into France and go to Marseille to get on a ship to Shanghai because he had his ticket in his hand. Gerda didn't. So she was smuggled that night along with about 7 or 8 young Jewish men from at night on the little Italian fishing boat to Nice. They were dropped off on the coast of Nice, and there they met, were able to make contact with a Jewish agency in Nice. Gerda never knew what happened to the other young men. They must have made their way, once they got to Nice, either to Palestine or Spain, or however they managed to get out. She had to go, however, to Paris because she could not get a ticket from the Jewish refugee agency unless she was physically in Paris in front of them. So she took a train with Henry to Paris, where she met, where the family was reunited, and Henry actually took his first steps in Paris at his great uncle's apartment. And from there, Gerda and John and Henry were able to obtain tickets to get to Shanghai. The uncle obviously had decided not to go, and they took a train back from Paris down to Marseille and then boarded a ship to Shanghai, China.
Okay, so this slide on the left is a letter that was from the Jewish Assistance Organization in Paris, advising that the tickets were available to go to Shanghai. I need to make a brief explanation now about Shanghai as a destination. Between 1937 and the end of 1939 into the beginning of 1940, there were roughly, the number varies depending on which source you use, but it's somewhere between 17,000 to 20,000 Jews, primarily from Germany and Austria, who were able to escape and to get into Shanghai. And the reason for Shanghai as a destination was a historic accident. Briefly, as a result of what were called the Opium Wars in the 1800s, the Chinese government had to make concessions to the French and to the English to create open trade zones in China. And one of those open trade destinations was the port of Shanghai, where you did not require a visa or any papers. So all of these 17, 20,000 people, including us, were able to enter Shanghai without the benefit of any legal immigration process. The picture on the right is the actual picture of the ship that we were on the voyage to Shanghai. So this was a 3-week voyage. This map tracks the ship, the voyage, starting from Marseille, going through Port Said, the Suez Canal, the boot to Colombo, Singapore, Saigon, and into Shanghai. But it was a 3-week voyage. And I have to emphasize here that my parents, as well as all the other people that were going to Shanghai, had absolutely no idea what they were going to, or what the conditions were going to be, or what was going to be there when they got there. And some had some funds left, some didn't. In our case, there was a very nominal amount of money left to try to do something with. So on the left, there are a couple of pictures that were actually taken on the ship. And if you didn't know any better, I guess you would think that there were people that were on a cruise, and I'm not sure that they do any better either. As I've indicated, picture on the top right is a documentary picture showing one of the ships arriving in Shanghai, the passengers getting off. And then the lower right-hand picture is what the port area, the Bund area in Shanghai looked like in 1939. So the next slide is my mother telling you what her first impression was of arriving in Shanghai.
This must have been the beginning of August. And it was 115 degrees, and the flies and the mosquitoes and the dirt and the filth was just awful. And I was allowed to take a rickshaw because it was Shabbos, so I was allowed to take a rickshaw with Henry, and I didn't say we had the second experience with the rickshaw there. We felt bad that human beings would pull us. We didn't like that. But they said they make a living with it, and that's the way it is. So we went to a place where my mother-in-law had cooked dinner and expected us, and she was also a very strong and positive person like her son, and said, it's not that bad. We're all here together. And she said, it's heat, it's hot, so we'll get used to it. So she kind of consoled us young ones. This must have been the beginning of our...
Okay, so now we're going to talk about life in Shanghai. I have to tell you, first of all, that so when we arrive, little funds, the issue is where are we going to live? There were relief organizations working in Shanghai with the refugees. There were two large refugee camps. They were in an area called Hongqiu, which was a very poor area that had suffered damage as a result of the war between the Chinese and the Japanese in the 30s. And it was within that sector that there were also single rooms to rent as an option to living in the refugee camp. And my father opted for us to live in one of these single rooms. And we lived in that room for 8 years, no kitchen, no toilet facilities, no running water. But we survived for 8 years in that room. So these pictures, briefly, the top left picture is a little later along, but it's a identity registration document of mine that I had to have, and it's in English and Chinese. And the line I always look at, it says duration of stay, and it says uncertain, which it was. Lower left is a picture with my paternal grandparents, Haas grandparents, myself, my mother, and then my aunt and uncle and my cousin. And the uncle, the fellow, the taller fella, he was a cantor, and he was actually the cantor at the Orthodox synagogue in Shanghai, which is called the Oh Hail Moshe Synagogue. The other photos, I think more or less speak for themselves. The Boy Scout photo, there was Boy Scout activity because of the English influence historically in Shanghai. The fellow on the far left is a friend of mine, lifelong in Seattle, Rolf Preuss, who's a retired architect, and he was in Shanghai with me, and we were friends there. So more pictures of life in Shanghai. Lower left, I went to school starting at age 4. I got a good basic education at a school called the Kadori School, which was endowed, funded by a family that had come from Iran in the 1880s already, a merchant Jewish family. And I'm where the red arrow is, got a good basic education start. Upper left is a wedding scene. Upper right, my father initially did laboring work in Chinese factories and whatever he could do to make a dollar. Eventually, my father had a good natural singing voice, and he actually trained himself to play the drums. And he ended up playing music in nightclubs and during World War II, which obviously we're talking about. We'll talk about Japanese in a moment, but he ended up playing in nightclubs, Japanese nightclubs. And the lower right-hand picture is a sort of a fun picture. They had soccer activity, and my father's in the middle with the costume, and I'm in the lower, I'm the ball boy down kneeling below.
So Henry talked about living in Hongqiu, and Hongqiu was the international district within the international district of Shanghai, and it was designated as such, and that's one of the reasons they could actually go there, because it was an internationally known port and had all of these provisos that people could come in there. However, the Japanese Sino-Japanese War had been going on, and the Japanese were dug in outside of Shanghai. And if any of you have seen The Land of the Rising Sun, the Spielberg movie with the little British boy, you'll know that. And what happened was that the Japanese army left the Jews who were living in Hongqiu alone. There were other Jews that were living in the other parts of Shanghai. In December 7th, 1941, when the Japanese Air Force bombed Honolulu, Pearl Harbor, this is when they marched into the international district. And they, there was a Nazi general in Tokyo who flew over and told the army Japanese leader, we want you to do away with these people. And the Japanese would not do that. They would not follow through on that request. So what they finally decided on was that they would consider the Jews in Hongqiu International Settlement as stateless refugees. They would insist that the other Jews that were throughout Shanghai move into the Hongqiu area, and they would all be living in this designated area, which in essence became a ghetto, because it was a ghetto without walls. And if you had to get a pass to go to any place else in Shanghai, and if you were found by the Japanese military without your pass, you were arrested and thrown in jail. So everybody was living in the ghetto without walls during that time in Hongqiu.
All right, so we remained there obviously until World War II, and I want to throw in the fact that for 6 months prior to the end of World War II in 1945, there was periodic bombing of the Hongqiu area. The bombing actually resulted from American forces that had bombed Japan coming back over, and because of the Japanese presence in that area, there was a munitions factory, there was a little Japanese military installation. They did drop some bombs, and there were about 125 or so of the refugee community that were killed. I have distinct recollections of the air raid sirens and that going on. But the war ends, however, we're still stateless refugees, whatever the proper term is. We now need to again turn to where are we going to go. It took 2 years to get visas to come to the United States. The 17,000, 20,000 people dispersed to Australia, to South America, England. Few, but not many, trickled back to Germany. Some ended up going to Israel when it was founded. But in any event, it took 2 years for us to get a visa. The picture on the left is the ship, the USS Marine Lynx, that we traveled on to the United States. It happened to be Passover during the trip, and there was the ship captain put on a Seder for the refugee passengers, about 250 of us, I think. And on the right is a thank you letter that was crafted by somebody that was given to the captain, thanking him for the Seder on this sort of Exodus trip that we were on. This is the route that we took. We went from Shanghai to Yokohama, just tied up at the dock. We were not allowed to get off the ship. It next went to Honolulu. We were allowed to get off the ship there, and I went to Waikiki Beach, and I went swimming in my underwear because I had no swimming suit. From Honolulu, the ship went on to San Francisco, where we entered the United States the day before my 9th birthday. So these two slides show the contrast between the streets of Shanghai on the left and San Francisco at the cable car turnaround. There's a small hotel on the left where the red arrow is. We were put up there for approximately a week by a refugee assistance committee. I will also say our trip was sponsored by HIAS, and most of you will know what HIAS is. And so now we're in San Francisco, we're non-English speaking refugees. And now the question is, where do we go from San Francisco? And so my father was given the option that if we would stay in the Western United States, he was given the choice of Phoenix, Seattle, or Portland, Oregon, that we could get assistance for a reasonable period of time until we managed to get on our feet.
So as most of you probably know, this is what they managed to escape from leaving Germany. There were over 500,000 Jews living in Germany in 1933, of which 214,000 managed to escape Germany. You know about the yellow stars, and the Nazis began deporting Jews to Auschwitz, Birkenau, or Theresienstadt in 1942. And of course, 6 million Jews were murdered during that Holocaust. 55 members of Henry's direct family relations were murdered during the Holocaust. As you recall, people had very large families and many of them could not get out. And you see Arbeit macht frei, which means work makes you free. And below is the Nazis sorting out Hungarian Jews. If you went to one side, you went to the gas chamber. If you went to the other side, you had to go to work. And you might not survive that also. And then you see the grandparents' death certificates sent by Gerda to Yad Vashem. They were murdered in March of 1943.
All right, so briefly, our journey in the United States took us from Portland, Oregon for 2 years. The next stop was Centralia, Washington, a little farm town at that time of about 4,000 people. I always say I transitioned from the streets of Shanghai at age 9 to Centralia at age 12. And then we ended up in Tacoma, Washington when I was 17 years old. We don't have the time to discuss what was behind these moves, but suffice it to say, my father ended up in business and had a retail store in Tacoma, Washington, and that's where we landed. These are just more photos of the period of growing up in Portland and in Centralia of me. 1954, 5 years after, 52 rather, 5 years after we arrived, we became American citizens. I had derivative citizenship, and this is my certificate of citizenship. I've been very proud to be an American ever since. And as life went on, I graduated from Stadium High School, went on to UPS, went on to the University of Washington Law School, where I actually started when I was 20 years old. The bottom two pictures are graduation from law school. Kate and I, also too long a story as to how we met. She came from England. I went to law school. We ended up getting married in Tacoma, 1963, in a Jewish wedding, as you could see. So 1997, which was the 50th anniversary after I arrived in the United States, Kate and I took a trip back to Shanghai. It was marvelous. Things were relatively intact as I remembered them from my childhood. This particular photo is taken adjacent to the doorway that led to the single room that we lived in for the 8 years that I mentioned to you.
We were back in Berlin in 2015 with Henry's cousin Arnold, who was from Arnold Benjamin. His mother was Gerda's sister, and he'd been in Shanghai also. And what we did was we installed what they call Stolpersteine, stumbling stones, which are all throughout Berlin, if you've been to Berlin. And they are put in front of the place where the people lived. So it's Maya Max Buchheim, Paula Buchheim, and then, as Henry mentioned, the Haases lived in the same apartment house. So we put one for Herbert Haas also. That was a wonderful one. The apartment house is no longer there. It was bombed, but there's a Waldorf school there. And the school principal and students participated in this ceremony. It was really a wonderful, wonderful day.
So as a result of the Holocaust and the spread of the family and members, this map depicts all the different locations in the world where I ended up with relatives. And over the course of the years, we've done a fair amount of traveling, and we've been to many of these destinations and places to visit with various of these relatives. This is my mother telling you what she thinks the lesson is that we should keep in mind from this whole experience.
That we shouldn't have any prejudice, that every human being, no matter color, creed, religion, are the same as we are. And we have to, the future generations have to see to that, not especially against Jews, just any discrimination against people. And of course, since we are Jewish, we want to keep our religion and people alive. We have to watch out that this can never happen again. Life is precious. Nobody has a right to take it away from another person.
So this photo is from 2019. Briefly, I was invited by the city government of Berlin to come there to participate in a exhibit that they mounted at the Red City Hall in the center of Berlin, commemorating 6 people who were born in Berlin, who were forced to leave, and telling their stories. And this story that we have shared with you today, as you can see, it's sort of mounted in part on the poster board behind, which was behind us. It was a great experience. It was a wonderful experience. And finally, this is on my mother's 90th birthday. This is a family picture, including our children and the grandchildren. And so, as you can see, we have a reconstituted family after a very long journey. And but that's essentially the story.
Henry, Kate, thank you so much. It's always such a pleasure to work with you. And we've got at least 10 minutes here for questions. And so some have already come in, which I'd love to start with. A couple people have actually asked about languages. Henry, did you learn Chinese, any dialect of Chinese while you were in Shanghai?
No, the brief answer is no. The refugee community, although we lived among the Chinese, really was in a self-contained community, and we spoke German. I had a few words of Chinese, but no, I did not. And actually, hindsight, retrospect would be that I wish I had learned Chinese.
And the language of instruction at the Kadoorie school was German then?
I'm sorry, what?
Yes, the language at the Kadoorie school was German.
Oh, yes, the Kadoorie school was German, although we did learn a bit of English. And so with the English proposition, after we landed in San Francisco and went up to Portland, I was placed at grade level according to my age, fourth grade. And children at that age can adapt to language fairly quickly, depending upon the environment. And so I picked up the language very quickly. There was a period of maybe 6 months, maybe more, where I did act as an interpreter for my parents to some extent, although they did really well. They both picked up the language very well, although, as you could hear from my mother's excerpts, as well as my dad also, they, of course, had accents for the rest of their life. I was fortunate at the age level that I came, and the fact that I lived in a broad community, in a Western community, that I was able to adapt with a language so that I came out of it with no accent. I can speak fluent German still, and if I convert to German, I don't have an accent in German either.
Thank you for that. A question from Leslie. Why did your family choose to travel or to come to the United States versus any other after the end of the war?
Why did we come to
Why
that?
did you choose to come to the United States?
Well, I have to speculate a little bit because I'm not sure that I ever directly had a conversation about that. But
I did.
I think, well, my wife says she knows, so let her answer the question.
I asked my mother-in-law that question. Why did you not return to Germany? And she said to me, in typical Gerda style, are you crazy? Would I go back there? So she said, when she found out that her parents had been murdered, which they knew nothing in Shanghai about what was going on in Europe. She couldn't believe it. And then they had to decide where they wanted to go. And they had relatives on the East Coast. And she wanted to go where she could be closer to relatives. And she said, let's go to America. And of course they were stateless. So they had to go through a whole variety of hoops to get actual sort of citizenship again, so they could land, come to America.
If I can add to that, though, the immigration system then was entirely based upon a quota, where a certain number of people every year could be admitted who had originated from certain countries. And so in our case, we were classified as Czechoslovakia. And in order for the number to come up in the Czechoslovakian quota, it took the 2 years that we're talking about. Now, there were other people who had other citizenship, historic citizenship, and so it varied, but I think, I guess I would have I guess my impression would have always been that because there were some relatives on the East Coast in New York, that's what was the motivating factor. Although, as you heard, we didn't obviously end up going there. We stayed in the West Coast.
Right. Thanks, Henry and Kate. A question from Dean. Did you experience anti-Semitism from people in Shanghai?
What's the question?
Did you experience anti-Semitism from the Chinese or the Japanese in Shanghai?
Well, I think as a child, I'm not sure it was directly anti-Semitism, but I think you saw in the slides a picture of me with boxing gloves on, and I didn't talk about that. But what that was really about was that it was pretty rough in the streets in Shanghai in the district for kids. And there was some conflict with Chinese kids. I'm not sure that it was anti-Semitic motivated, but the point of the boxing club was for me to learn a bit about self-defense. And that's actually why I ended up in the boxing club. Now, I will make one other comment about this. I always have had a distinct recollection of Japanese children marching to school in school uniforms in columns with a teacher at the back of the group with a big snapping whip that the teacher would use if any of those kids got out of line. And I've always in my mind remembered that as contrast sort of to the relatively, this is not a derogatory comment, just a childhood recollection of what I've always recalled as being a rather undisciplined sort of situation with the Chinese. And I have to remember the living conditions of the Chinese in that sector were awful. I mean, they were also living in like these single rooms. Streets were littered with sometimes dead bodies. There were beggars in the street. So it was a pretty rough area, but direct anti-Semitic activity, I'm not sure I could say that.
I will just add that I asked my mother-in-law that question. She said, no, the kids didn't like them because they were like white people. They didn't know what Jews were. They just saw them as Europeans and they weren't happy about that. But she said the Chinese were fine. The Chinese and actually the few Japanese with whom they met, they were fine. They didn't discriminate against them because they were Jews. And in fact, when it was the Chinese New Year, the Chinese people, as poor as they were, would actually bring and share some food with them. It was an interesting situation.
Thanks for that information. I'm going to read a question from Shira. Did your family try to keep any Jewish traditions in Shanghai? Kosher, Jewish holidays? Can you talk about that a bit?
Did your family keep any Jewish traditions, kosher, holidays?
Oh, very much so. Now, I have to explain that my grandparents, my father's parents, were strictly Orthodox. And my father actually was not. But I grew up under the influence of those grandparents. And as I also mentioned along the way, my uncle was the cantor at the synagogue. And we spent almost every Friday Shabbat at my grandparents', and we celebrated all the holidays. And I started Cheder, which is Hebrew school, at age 4. Also, that was at that synagogue, at the Ohio Moshe Synagogue, was the religious school. And so there was definitely, yes, we did. And there was an Orthodox community within the larger community of several thousand, although there were the majority, though, I think were not particularly religious. It's no different than today, really. But I guess the short answer is yes. There was very much, I participated very much in religious traditional observances. By the way, can I say one other thing about this synagogue that I've been talking about briefly? I don't know how the time is, but today there is a museum in Shanghai called the Shanghai Jewish Refugee Museum, which you can Google and it'll come up. But the museum is actually built structurally around the building where the synagogue used to be. And
Which still is, yeah.
yes, and the museum online has links to photos, educational background material, and so forth. That museum was not yet in existence when we were there in 1997. At that time, there were 2 rooms set aside in the building where the synagogue formerly used to be, and those 2 rooms had an exhibit of photos and that sort of thing from this Shanghai refugee community experience. And Kate and I actually connected with a Chinese man who had lived his whole life there, who called himself the curator of the museum. And
nice.
he took us, I had a list of addresses that my mother had provided as to where my grandparents lived, where we lived, so forth and so forth. And so this Chinese fellow took us around to the various locations. And I don't know what the time frame, our time is, Julia. There's
2
one
minutes.
other story potentially about going back to the room, but if I don't have time, I won't do it.
Well, we are about 2 minutes from finishing. So if you don't mind, I wanted to ask one final question. And that is, we heard Gerda at the end talk a little about her hopes for the future. And I was just wondering if you could share with us, Henry, your own advice or wishes for young people today.
And again,
your mother shared her advice for the future.
Yeah.
What advice do you have for the future?
Yes. Well, I mean, based on, first of all, obviously, this experience that I went through as a child, not only as a child, but also the immigrant experience in coming to the States and getting reconstituted and so forth, have all shaped me as a person. And so I guess the message that I would have is that to young people is that we basically all have to have tolerance for others, regardless of differences. And we have to be mindful of the fact that our society that we live in has to be able to cater to the needs of everybody. And that needs are different. They're not all the same. You know, I mean, for instance, in my case, our own case, I've been very fortunate that I made a great career decision, which is another story how I got to be a lawyer. I can't take the time to tell you that, but I made a good decision. I've had a 59-year career at this point, being a lawyer. I'm still lawyering because I still like it. I guess the point would be that you know, we have to have a society in which we're mindful of everybody's particular needs, their particular interests, their particular cultures, and that's what I think. That's what I think the message is.
Thank you so much for that. And thank you, Henry and Kate, for the entire presentation. It was just wonderful. And I apologize to the attendees for not being able to get to all of your great questions. I'd just like to also thank everyone for attending. I'd like to thank Michelle Quinones for providing closed captioning for us. We're very grateful at the center for the expertise of Richard Green, our Museum and Technology Director, for the behind the scenes help on Lunch and Learns. Thank you also to the Holocaust Center's Executive Director, Dee Simon, and our whole team at the center. Ilana Cohn-Kennedy, Nicole Bella, Lori Borschall-Cohen, Amanda Davis, Paul Regelbrug, Sydney Draytell, Ellie Selesky, Rick Brewer, Morgan Romero, Katie Lawrence, and our interns Craig Verniest and Devonshire Lockey. Next week, March 9th at noon, join us for a special legal program at our regular Lunch and Learn slot with Amos Giora, Professor of Law at the S.J. Quinney College of Law at the University of Utah. This presentation, titled Crime of Complicity, Law and the Bystander from the Holocaust to Today, is open to all with registration on our website and also offers 1 CLE credit to members of the Washington State Bar Association. The views, information, and opinions expressed in our programs are solely those of the individuals involved and do not necessarily represent those of the Holocaust Center for Humanity. This program has been recorded, and you can watch it on our website starting tomorrow. Stay safe and be well, everyone. This concludes our program today.